Not for the first time, a US Secretary of State and an Israeli Prime Minister side by side affirming their alliance. But the smiles were strained, and even personal praise for the US ambassador to Israel was met with what sounded like sarcasm.
And is deeply committed to the relationship between Israel and the United States.
Yeah, he's okay.
If it was a difficult meeting, the cause was clear: Israel's opposition to reviving the Iran nuclear deal, which it says will make it easier for Iran to attain a nuclear weapon. Israel also opposes one of the moves the US is reportedly ready to make to get the deal done: removing Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps from its list of foreign terror organizations.
Their proxy, the Houthis, just this weekend carried out a horrific attack on Saudi Arabia. I hope the United States will hear the concerned voices from the region, Israel's and others, on this very important issue.
His guest tried to make the case that while the preferred means may differ, the goal was shared.
There is no daylight between us on the fundamental proposition that Iran must never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. And whether there is a return to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, or not, that principle will not change, nor will our commitment to it.
But as the details of this long-negotiated deal solidify, the daylight between Israel and the US becomes ever more glaring. And there are differences too on a separate issue: Israel's stance on the war in Ukraine. Israel has provided humanitarian aid, but its prime minister hasn't condemned Russia's invasion, out of a public wish to be a mediator and less public concerns about any changes to Russia's role and Israel's interests in Syria. Israel's foreign minister has condemned the invasion and promised Israel won't be used to bypass sanctions, but there's been so far little evidence of that in terms of policy. After a raft of Israeli government meetings, a stop in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Last year, Blinken committed to reopening the US consulate that dealt with Palestinian relations. So far, it hasn't happened.
Despite the crimes of Israeli occupation that have reached the stage of ethnic cleansing and racial discrimination as considered by human rights organizations, as well as its continuous aggressions, we don't find any party that holds Israel accountable.
Blinken's visit is not yet over. The foreign ministers of the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain and Egypt joining the Israelis and Americans for a summit in the southern Negev desert. A chance for Israel to promote its normalization with some Arab states and continue to press the US on Iran. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem.